Aro buddhir avyaktam evacha indriyani tasaikam cha panchachendriya gocharaha ichchatvesha sukam dukam sanghataschetana-dhritihi etakshetram samasena savikaram udaritam. The five great elements, false ego, intelligence, the unmanifested, the 10 senses, the mind, the 5 sense objects, desire, hatred, happiness, distress, the aggregate, the life symptoms, and convictions, all these are considered in summary to be the field of activities and its interactions. Text 8 through 12. Amanitvam adambitvam ahimsa kshantir arjavam acharyopasanam shochang saryam atma vinigraha indriyarteshu vairagyam ahankankara evacha jara vyadi dukadoshanudarshanam asaktiranibishvanga putradara grihadishu nityam cha samachittatvam ishtanishtopapatishu mayichan sevitam aritir janna samsadi adhyatma jnana nityatvam tattva jnanartha darshanam etaj jnanam iti proktam ajnanam yadatonyata. Humility, pridelessness, non-violence, tolerance, simplicity, approaching a bona fide spiritual master, cleanliness, steadiness, and self-control, renunciation of the objects of sense gratification, absence of false ego, the perception of the evil of birth, death, old age, and disease, non-attachment to children, wife, home, and the rest, and even-mindedness amid pleasant and unpleasant events, constant and unalloyed devotion to me, resorting to solitary places, detachment from the general mass of people, accepting the importance of self-realization, and philosophical search for the absolute truth. All these I thus declare to be knowledge, and what is contrary to these is ignorance. Right. Text 13. Gyeyam yattat pravakshyami yajgyatva mritam ashnute anadi matparam brahma nasatan nasad uchyate. I shall now explain the knowable, knowing which you will taste the eternal. This is beginningless, and it is subordinate to me. It is called Brahman, the Spirit, and it lies beyond the cause and effect of this material world. Text 14. Sarvata panipadam tat sarvatokshi shiromukham sarvata shrutimaloke sarvam avritya tishtati. Everywhere are his hands and legs, his eyes and faces, and he hears everything. In this way, the Supersoul exists. Text 15. Sarvendriya gunabhasam sarvendriya vivarjitam asaktam vrichchaiva nirgunam gunabhokricha. The Supersoul is the original source of all senses, yet he is without senses. He is unattached, although he is the maintainer of all living beings. He transcends the modes of nature, and at the same time, he is the master of all modes of material nature. Text 16. Bahir anantascha bhutanam archaram charam evacha sukshmatvat tad avigyayam durastam chantike chatat. The Supreme Truth exists both internally and externally, in the moving and non-moving. He is beyond the power of the material senses to see or to know. Although far, far away, he is also near to all. Okay. Thank you very much for being here and for chanting. So let's take a look at some translation and purports given by His Divine Grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. Jai. Text, chapter 13, text 6 and 7. The five great elements, false ego, intelligence, the unmanifested, the 10 senses, the mind, the 5 sense objects, desire, hatred, happiness, distress, the aggregate, the life symptoms, and convictions, all these are considered in summary to be the field of activities and its interactions. Purport. From all the authoritative statements of the great sages, the Vedic hymns, and the aphorisms of the Vedanta Sutra, the components of this world are earth, water, fire, air, and ether. These are the five great elements, Mahabhuta. Then there are three modes of nature. Then there are false ego, intelligence, and the unmanifested stage of the three modes of nature. Then there are 5 senses for acquiring knowledge, the eyes, ears, nose, tongue, and touch. Then 5 working senses, voice, legs, hands, the anus, and the genitals. Then above the senses there is the mind, which is within and which can be called the sense within. Therefore, including the mind, there are 11 senses altogether. Then there are the 5 objects of the senses, smell, taste, warmth, touch, and sound. Now, the aggregate of these 24 elements is called the field of activity. If one makes an analytical study of these 24 subjects, then he can very well understand the field of activity. Then there is desire, hatred, pleasure, and pain, which are interactions, representations of the 5 great elements in the gross body. The living symptoms represented by consciousness and conviction are the manifestation of the subtle body, mind, ego, and intelligence. Pardon me, I read that kind of strange. I'll repeat. The living symptoms represented by consciousness and conviction are the manifestation of the subtle body, mind, ego, and intelligence. These subtle elements are included within the field of activities. The 5 great elements are a gross representation of the subtle false ego. They are the representation in the material conception. Consciousness is represented by intelligence, of which the unmanifested stage is the 3 modes of material nature. The unmanifested 3 modes of material nature is called pradhana. One who desires to know the 24 elements in detail along with their interactions should study the philosophy in more detail. In Bhagavad Gita, a summary only is given. The body is the representation of all these factors, and there are changes of the body, which are 6 in number. The body is born, it grows, it stays, it produces byproducts, then begins to decay, and at the last stage, it vanishes. Therefore, the field is a non-permanent material thing. However, the kshetragya, the knower of the field, its proprietor, is different. Okay, so this is an analytical study of the different components of the field of activities. which is called Kshetram or Kshetra. So Kurukshetra is the battlefield which this conversation took place, and Kshetra refers to a field. As I've heard it described before, there's a field like a cultivation field, like in a plot of land, and there's a cultivator who knows that plot. So that's like the soul, and the field is the body. If it doesn't, it's not very it's not very intelligent for some cultivator to think that he is that field which he actually cultivates. No, he knows this is the field and I am cultivating it. Right? So similarly, the soul resides within the body and is more or less the knower of the body. But we're not the supreme knower, and therefore our knowledge is limited. So there are two kshetragyas within one body, and we heard many verses following this verse which kind of delineate differences between the individual soul and the super soul. And so we'll actually continue reading, but this analytical study is not fully described here in Bhagavad Gita, as Prabhupada mentions. So a few points were hit here. One point that stood out from what Prabhupada put in the purport is that, there's the 5 gross elements and the 3 subtle elements, which is, for us studying Bhagavad Gita, we hear this many times. But in chapter 7, there's a summary of these elements, which is given by Krishna himself. And so chapter 7, text number 4, you can find it on page 350. Let's check that out real quick. Just to give another place to find this. And so chapter 7, text 4 is on page 350. And we'll chant the Sanskrit for that. So, Bhumirapo nalo vayu kangmano buddhirevacha ahangara iti yangbe bina prakritirashtadha. Earth, water, fire, air, ether, mind, intelligence, and false ego. Altogether, these 8 comprise my separated material energies. Then text 5. Apareyam itastvanyam prakritim vidime param jiva bhutam mahabaho yayedam daryate jagat. Besides this inferior nature, O mighty armed Arjuna, there is a superior energy of mine, which are all living entities who are struggling with material nature and are sustaining the universe. So we're struggling with this material nature, but we are different from the matter. So there's the field which has the gross elements and the subtle elements, and then there's the soul. But there's many more details to the field, which were enumerated here, but we'll actually continue with the next text. This purport will be really nice, so let's hear that. Chapter 13, text 8. Humility, pridelessness, non-violence, tolerance, simplicity, approaching a bona fide spiritual master, cleanliness, steadiness, and self-control, renunciation of the objects of sense gratification, absence of false ego, the perception of the evil of birth, death, old age, and disease, non-attachment to children, wife, home, and the rest, and even-mindedness amid pleasant and unpleasant events, constant and unalloyed devotion to me, resorting to solitary places, detachment from the general mass of people, accepting the importance of self-realization and philosophical search for the absolute truth. All these I thus declare to be knowledge, and what is contrary to these is ignorance. Purport. This process of knowledge is sometimes misunderstood by less intelligent men as being the interaction of the field of activity. But actually, this is the real process of knowledge. If one accepts this process, then the possibility of approaching the absolute truth exists. This is not the interaction of the tenfold elements as described before. This is actually the means to get out of it. Of all the descriptions of the process of knowledge, the most important point is described in the 10th line of the first line of the 10th verse. The process of knowledge terminates in unalloyed devotional service to the Lord. So, if one does not approach or is not able to approach the transcendental service of the Lord, then the other 19 items are of no particular value. But if one takes to devotional service in full Krishna consciousness, the other 19 items automatically develop within him. The principle of accepting a spiritual master, as mentioned in the 7th verse, is essential. Even for one who takes to devotional service, it is most important. Transcendental life begins when one accepts a bona fide spiritual master. The Supreme Personality of Godhead, Sri Krishna, clearly states here that this process of knowledge is the actual path. Anything speculated beyond this is nonsense. As for the knowledge outlined here, the items may be analyzed as follows. Humility means that one should not be anxious to have the satisfaction of being honored by others. The material conception of life makes us very eager to receive honor from others, but from the point of view of a man in perfect knowledge, who knows that he is not this body, anything, honor or dishonor, pertaining to this body is useless. One should not be hankering after this material deception. People are very anxious to be famous for their religion, and consequently, sometimes it is found that without understanding the principles of religion, one enters into some group which is not actually following religious principles, and then wants to advertise himself as a religious mentor. As for actual advancement in spiritual science, one should have a test to see how far he is progressing. He can judge by these items. Nonviolence is generally taken to mean not killing or destroying the body, but actually nonviolence means not to put others into distress. People in general are trapped by ignorance in the material concept of life, and they perpetually suffer material pains. So unless one elevates people to spiritual knowledge, one is practicing violence. One should try his best to distribute real knowledge to the people so that they may become enlightened and leave this material entanglement. That is nonviolence. Tolerance means that one should be practiced to bear insult and dishonor from others. If one is engaged in the advancement of spiritual knowledge, there will be so many insults and much dishonor from others. This is expected because material nature is so constituted. Even a boy like Prahlada, who, only 5 years old, was engaged in the cultivation of spiritual knowledge, was endangered when his father became antagonistic to his devotion. The father tried to kill him in so many ways, but Prahlada tolerated him. So, for making advancement in spiritual knowledge, there may be many impediments, but we should be tolerant and continue our progress with determination. Simplicity means that without diplomacy, one should be so straightforward that he can disclose the real truth even to an enemy. As for acceptance of the spiritual master, that is essential, because without the instruction of a bona fide spiritual master, one cannot progress in the spiritual science. One should approach the spiritual master with all humility and offer him all services so that he will be pleased to bestow his blessings upon the disciple. Because a bona fide spiritual master is a representative of Krishna, If he bestows any blessings upon his disciple, that will make the disciple immediately advanced without the disciples following the regulative principles. Or the regulative principles will be easier for one who has served the spiritual master without reservation. Cleanliness is essential for making advancement in spiritual life. There are two kinds of cleanliness, external and internal. External cleanliness means taking a bath, but for internal cleanliness, one has to think of Krishna always and chant Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. This process cleans the accumulated dust of past karma from the mind. Steadiness means that one should be very determined to make progress in spiritual life. Without such determination, one cannot make tangible progress. And self-control means that one should not accept anything which is detrimental to the path of spiritual progress. One should become accustomed to this and reject anything which is against the path of spiritual progress. This is real renunciation. The senses are so strong that they are always anxious to have sense gratification. One should not cater to these demands, which are not necessary. The senses should only be gratified to keep the body fit, so that one can discharge his duty in advancing in spiritual life. The most important and uncontrollable sense is the tongue. If one can control the tongue, then there is even every possibility of controlling the other senses. The function of the tongue is to taste and to vibrate. Therefore, by systematic regulation, the tongue should always be engaged in tasting the remnants of foodstuffs offered to Krishna and chanting Hare Krishna. As far as the eyes are concerned, they should not be allowed to see anything but the beautiful form of Krishna. That will control the eyes. Similarly, the ears should be engaged in hearing about Krishna, and the nose in smelling the flowers offered to Krishna. This is the process of devotional service, and it is understood here that Bhagavad Gita is simply expounding the science of devotional service. Devotional service is the main and sole objective. Unintelligent commentators on the Gita try to divert the mind of the reader to other subjects, but there is no other subject in Bhagavad Gita but devotional service. False ego means accepting this body as oneself. When one understands that he is not his body and is spirit soul, that is real ego. Ego is there. False ego is condemned, but not real ego. In the Vedic literature, it is said, Aham Brahmasmi, I am Brahman, I am spirit. This I am, the sense of self, also exists in the liberated stage of self-realization. This sense of I am is ego, but when the sense of I am is applied to this false body, it is false ego. When the sense of self is applied to reality, that is real ego. There are some philosophers who say we should give up our ego, but we cannot give up our ego because ego means identity. We ought, of course, to give up the false identification with the body. One should try to understand the distress of accepting birth, death, old age, and disease. There are descriptions in various Vedic literatures of birth. In the Srimad Bhagavatam, the world of the unborn, the child's stay in the womb of the mother, its suffering, etc., are all very graphically described. It should be thoroughly understood that birth is distressful. Because we forget how much distress we have suffered within the womb of the mother, we do not make any solution to the repetition of birth and death. Similarly, at the time of death, there are all kinds of sufferings, and they are also mentioned in the authoritative scriptures. These should be discussed. As far as disease and old age are concerned, everyone gets practical experience. No one wants to be diseased. and no one wants to become old, but there is no avoiding these. Unless we have a pessimistic view of this material life, considering the distresses of birth, death, old age, and disease, there is no impetus for our making advancement in spiritual life. As for detachment from children, wife, and home, it is not meant that one should have no feeling for these. They are natural objects of affection, but when they are not favorable to spiritual progress, then one should not be attached to them. The best process for making the home pleasant is Krishna consciousness. If one is in full Krishna consciousness, he can make his home very happy, because this process of Krishna consciousness is very easy. One need only chant Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Accept the remnants of foodstuffs offered to Krishna. Have some discussion on books like Bhagavad Gita and Srimad Bhagavatam, and engage oneself in deity worship. These four will make one happy. One should train the members of his family in this way. The family members can sit down morning and evening and chant together, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. If one can mold his life, family life, in this way, to develop Krishna consciousness, following these four principles, then there is no need to change from family life to renounced life. But if it is not congenial, not favorable for spiritual advancement, then family life should be abandoned. One must sacrifice everything to realize or serve Krishna, just as Arjuna did. Arjuna did not want to kill his family members, but when he understood that these family members were impediments to his Krishna realization, he accepted the instruction of Krishna and fought and killed them. In all cases, one should be detached from the happiness and distress of family life, because in this world, one can never be fully happy or fully miserable. Happiness and distress are concomitant factors of material life. One should learn to tolerate as advised in Bhagavad Gita. One can never restrict the coming and going of happiness and distress, so one should be detached from the materialistic way of life and be automatically equiposed in both cases. Generally, when we get something desirable, we are very happy. And when we get something undesirable, we are distressed. But if we are actually, in the spiritual position, these things will not agitate us. To reach that stage, we have to practice unbreakable devotional service. Devotional service to Krishna without deviation means engaging oneself in the 9 processes of devotional service: chanting, hearing, worshiping, offering respect, etc., as described in the last verse of the 9th chapter. That process should be followed. Naturally, when one is adapted to the spiritual way of life, he will not want to mix with materialistic men. That would go against his grain. One may test himself by seeing how far he is inclined to live in a solitary place without unwanted association. Naturally, a devotee has no taste for unnecessary sporting or cinema going or enjoying some social function, because he understands that these are simply a waste of time. There are many research scholars and philosophers who study sex life or some other subject, but according to Bhagavad Gita, such research work and philosophical speculation have no value. That is more or less nonsensical. According to Bhagavad Gita, one should make research by philosophical discretion into the nature of the soul. One should make research to understand with what the self is concerned. That is recommended here. As far as spirit self-realization is concerned, it is clearly stated here that Bhakti Yoga is especially practical. As soon as there is a question of devotion, one must consider the relationship between the supersoul and the individual soul. The individual soul and the supersoul cannot be one, at least not in the Bhakti conception, in the devotional conception of life. This service of the individual soul to the Supreme Soul is eternal, nityam, as is clearly stated. So, bhakti, or devotional service, is eternal. One should be established in that philosophical conviction. Otherwise, it is only a waste of time, ignorance. In the Srimad Bhagavatam, this is explained. Vadanti tat tattvavidas tattam yajnanam advayam. Quote, those who are actually knowers of the absolute truth know that the self is realized in three different phases as Brahman, Paramatma, and Bhagavan. Bhagavatam 1.2.11. Bhagavan is the last word in the realization of the absolute truth. Therefore, one should reach up to that platform of understanding the Supreme Personality of Godhead, and thus engage in the devotional service of the Lord. That is perfection of knowledge. Beginning from practicing humility up to the point of realization of the Supreme Truth, the Absolute Personality of Godhead, this process is just like a staircase beginning from the ground floor up to the top floor. Now on this staircase, there are so many people who have reached the first floor, the second or third floor, etc. But unless one reaches the top floor, which is the understanding of Krishna, he is at a lower stage of knowledge. If anyone wants to compete with God and at the same time make advancement in spiritual knowledge, he will be frustrated. It is clearly stated that without humility, understanding is harmful. To think oneself God is most puffed up. Although the living entity is always being kicked by the stringent laws of material nature, still he thinks, I am subordinate to material nature. One must know and be convinced of this truth. Jai. So, there's a lot of nice things here. The one thing I'll mention before we have a few questions and comments is that this point that we're always being kicked, but still we think that I am God. So Prabhupada gave one example in the Krishna magazine. There's a small magazine called Krishna, the Reservoir of Pleasure. And it's actually a lecture from Prabhupada. And actually I read it today with Rishi Kumar Prabhu. And it's really nice. And in there, he's mentioning that there's a man in the hospital and he's got some disease. So he has to have a very stringent diet and he can't get up. So he's passing stool and water on himself, pretty much. And he has to take bitter medicine, and the nurses have to come and cleanse his body, or else there's an abominable smell that starts coming. And his friend comes and says, how are you doing? He says, I'm well. And so Prabhupada's saying, how is this? You're having such abominable life and you're saying, I'm good, I'm well. This is Maya. This is Maya. So still, when our friend comes, we think, no, I'm doing good, And there's also another example, like we put on a show, I'm enjoying. I'm God, I always enjoy. So this is Maya. This is illusion. We're actually suffering, which was stated that we have to kind of get that picture. We got to see that. That's reality. That's okay. It's not pessimistic in total because there's a positive alternative, right? We know there's a real life There is real life, but this is a little bogus, you know. So let's live real life right now by the mercy of the spiritual master. He gives some seva, and he gives instructions, he gives knowledge. Krishna gives Gita. We're contacting Krishna directly through these words. He's instructing us personally. And Prabhupada is also transcendentally empowered to give us instructions exactly what we need to hear. So every time you open this book or any of Prabhupada's books, you're in direct contact with Prabhupada, and Krishna can arrange that you read exactly the words that you need to hear to make your advancement. Okay, so thank you very much, devotees. Were there some questions maybe we can open? Bhakti Damodar Prabhu.
Yes, Prabhu. So a fairly straightforward question. On page 607 in the purport, Prabhupada, he's talking about, he says, and then there are the 5 objects of the senses: smell, taste, warmth, touch, and sound. The warmth confuses me. And then what about sight? Right, I don't know. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Well, usually we use the word form, like eyes perceive form. As far as any typo or thing or something like that, I'm not sure how I can. I can't be taken as any authority, so I'll kind of defer that. Maybe, yeah. It's page number 607, first paragraph, middle. 5 sense objects, or 5 objects of the senses. So, do you want to speak something, Prabhu?
Hare Krishna, but you were speaking about fire. So actually, the sense of sight is the corresponding element is fire. So we're able to see based on that element of fire. So when I hear warmth, it makes me think of just that somehow or other we're able to see that object because of its warmth or its emanation of light. Fire is also light, and heat is a symptom of fire.
Did you want to ask something, Prabhu? So maybe we can do a little more research. And Prabhupada mentions that these elements are corresponding, and that's in the Bhagavatam, right? So we can try to see there a little more minutely. Any other thing? Kumar Prabhu?
Are comments okay?
Yeah.
Okay, there are just 3 things that came to mind. You were talking about that example of like the false happiness in the material world with someone in a miserable condition saying, "I'm well." I heard in one of Maharaja's classes this point about how it may look like people are really happy even though they're suffering under the laws of material nature. They're enwrapped in material life, but they've got all these smiles walking around and on the plaza or wherever. And he had made this point how these smiles of the people who are being pricked by the thorns of material nature are compared to this so-called smile you may see on someone in like a electric chair. So when they turn on the electricity, if you're looking really closely, you can say, "Oh, that one looks like it might be a smile," or "Oh, that looks like it might be this expression or that for a second, or maybe that expression." But it's actually suffering. And then there were some nice points about controlling the senses that we read, and it just made me remember these 2 points that I took a note of recently, which was this one. The more one is advanced, the more he is freed from the clutches of matter. The Lord is not partial toward anyone. Everything depends on one's practical performance of duties in an effort to control the senses and conquer the influence of desire and anger. That last sentence. That last sentence connected to something we read. Sorry, I forgot. But I thought it was really interesting. Everything depends on one's practical performance of duties in an effort to control the senses and conquer the influence of desire and anger. Lord's not partial to anyone. And then there was just one more. This one that I had read recently on this controlling the senses. A person who is actually advanced in self-realization protects his energy by controlling the senses, just like this is in the Krishna book, how in the autumn season the farmers they keep the water in the field by building strong walls, because they know no more rains are going to come. So they build these strong walls to keep the water in the field. So in the same way, someone endeavoring for self-realization, they control the senses to protect their energy. And that analogy was specifically talking about how at the age of 50, one gives up family life and then uses all of their energy for self-realization.
Thank you, Prabhu. Okay. So let us take up this process of knowledge and become free from this repeated cycle of birth and death and attain to our real birthright, which is pure devotional service with the Supreme Lord Sri Krishna. Srimad Bhagavad Gita ki jai, Srila Prabhupada ki jai. All glories to the assembled devotees.